since the fall in the prices of crude oil globally, which has affected financial resources of oil-producing countries. It behoves on the countries to source for another means, and that's why the diversification of the economy with agriculture as a centerpiece in Nigeria remain an issue of interest. In the case of Nigeria, 70% of the population is involved in agriculture and other activities, and government is putting everything in place to ensure that we redress some challenges which include low production and low quality produce, which does not meet international best practices. We'll have an expert as our guest on the spot today to throw more light on how best we can improve agriculture in our country to meet international best practice. This is On the Spot. I am Cliff Ayoze, and you get to meet our guest in a moment. My guest today was part of the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria between 1991 and 2000. And before joining the International Institute for International Tropical Agriculture in Kenya in March 2012 to lead the Central Africa Hub and the Natural Resource Management Research Area. In this capacity, he's also having an oversight role in humid tropics, the water, land, and ecosystems, and the CCAF's SIGA research programs. Prior to this recent appointment, or recent position, he was the leader of the Integrated Soil Fertility Management Program of the Tropical Soil Biology and Fertility Research Area of CIAT. He joined the CIAT TSBF in 2001 and led the development, adaptation, and dissemination of best ISFM options in various agroecological zones in sub-Saharan Africa. In September 2010, he obtained a visiting professor position at the Swedish Agricultural University in Uppsala in the Soils and Environment Department. Before this, he worked in Nigeria for a number of years. He holds a whole lot. When we talk about agriculture, he remains an authority there, focusing on unraveling the mechanisms underlying nutrient and soil organic matter dynamics in tropical agro-ecosystems. In that context, he obtained his PhD in 1996 in applied biological sciences. Has also supervised most MScs and PhD candidates in that direction. Please join me in welcoming the Director, IITA Central Africa, Dr. Bernard Vanlauwe. It's my pleasure to have you join us.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Well, you're just in Nigeria this time around, you know, having left the IITA in Nigeria way back in 2000. And between 1991 and 2000, one would be wondering your experience because agriculture has attained a different height currently. Let's share your experience from when you were in Nigeria.
Yeah, I came to Nigeria in 1991 as a quite junior scientist. So in those days, IITA is a research organization, as you know. So in those days, we thought as researchers, we had the solutions that we often developed under our research stations, and that we would just need to transfer to the extension services and then the farmers would pick it up. So we were doing our research quite in isolation, if I may use that term. Of course, we've seen that over the years, when you have developed your so-called solutions under your own controlled environments, you take them to the farmers' fields. You see that the farmers have quite some issues with adopting some of those practices. I'm going to give the example of alley cropping, which was generated in Nigeria in the 1980s. People were advised to grow trees between their maize. And those trees, if you cut down the leaves and so on and apply it to the soil, they will increase maize productivity and so on and so on. Works very well under on-station conditions. When you bring that technology to the farm, to smallholder farms, you see a lot of economic constraints, land tenure constraints, and so on, labor constraints. So we immediately saw, after a number of years, this is not really the best solution. So what has happened in the 10 years that I was in IITA at first is that we saw a shift from being quite supply driven in terms of solutions, to placing our research much more in the context of farming conditions, listening to farmers, see what their problems are, and then develop a solution rather than vice versa. So while I give the example of valley cropping, for instance, towards the latter period of my stay in IITA, the late 90s I would say, we started working a lot in northern Nigeria, the Zaria Kaduna area. We started working a lot more on crops and issues that farmers want, that they see immediate benefit from. An example is soybean. As you know, today Nigeria is the biggest producer of soybean in Africa, far above South Africa and some other producers. So the soybean was one of those crops that we saw that the farmers could have interested in. It's bringing income, it's bringing protein for nutrition, and it's helping your soil. So we started working on those crops that are economically beneficial to smallholder farmers and that give immediate returns. Farmers are often prioritizing short-term benefits because they need to make money today and eat today, not in 2 years' time. They don't have 4 years to wait for a tree to grow and give them the... Of course, my last 2 years in Nigeria, we really started working on issues that are much more relevant and with impact that we can actually see today. I've given the example of soybean, but I could also talk about coffee and improve maize production and so on.
Africa is dominantly an agrarian continent. You will agree with me.
Absolutely.
And your experience in Kenya as compared to what obtains in Nigeria, we want you to try to draw a line on how agriculture is faring there as in contrast to what obtains in Nigeria.
In Kenya, there's a diverse picture. Yeah, and it's probably important to learn lessons learned from Kenya. Farmers around Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, they are doing very well because there is a big demand for food products. There are well-established markets for milk and maize and other products. So this active linkages, value addition, is bringing a lot of money back to the farming communities in central Kenya. If you go to western Kenya, people live far from markets, have small plots of land that have grown smaller over the years because of population growth. So you see the picture you see there is that little has changed over the past 10 years because of these constraints. If you go to Nigeria, especially in the areas that I referred, I know the area around Kaduna, Kano best because that's where I spend a lot of my time.
Okay.
One big difference I would say between the Nigerian farmer and the Kenyan farmer is that the Nigerian farmer wants to make money with farming. If you ask a number of farmers in the west of Kenya, what is your job? They will say no job, but they are farming. So they don't see farming as a way out of poverty. They see farming as something you have to do to survive. But if you would have a choice to do something else, they would do something else. If you go to a lot of the farmers in northern Nigeria, farmers want to farm. They want to adapt best practices. Of course, they still have constraints where the IITA and so on is trying to do something about, but the mentality of farming is absolutely different. We also know that in the north of Nigeria, the access to agro inputs, access to markets, land size, they are still not as much a constraint as they are in the west of Kenya because the population is less dense, although there's of course a lot of people living on that land also here. Yeah.
Now, when we talk about agriculture and the work the research institutes do, you come up with a lot of innovations and we have this extension services challenge.
Yeah.
There is a huge gap between the research you do or the output of the research and its application to farms. What is your view on this? How can we begin to bridge that gap?
I talked already about an example. I talked about valley cropping, which was an example which was research driven. And where we only found after 20 years of working on it that it's not going to go anywhere. So I've already talked that by placing our research in the context of smallholder farming, we are doing much more relevant work. IITA currently is working on 4 research areas. We have the genetic improvement of crops, especially maize, cassava, yams, banana, plantain, coffee and soybean. The impact that you can see from some of those crops in Nigeria is quite large. I've talked about the soybean example, the cassava example. There is quite a number of constraints and pests that really had big impacts on cassava productivity, which are resolved through introducing better crops. The second area is integrated pest management. At one time, in about 25 years ago, I believe, there was a huge pest of cassava that was actually going to destroy the crop, the cassava mealybug. Can you imagine Nigeria without cassava? Imagine there's no more cassava in Nigeria. What would happen to the country? So IITA had a solution, a biological control solution that actually killed that major pest. And there is still cassava partly because of that. So this is a second example of integrated pest management. The third area we are working on is appropriate soil management. We call it integrated soil fertility management, but that's a bit complicated. So what we want to do is, we know that to increase productivity in Africa, just like everywhere else in the world, you need agro inputs. You need fertilizer. We cannot improve productivity in Africa without using those inputs. But we can use them wisely and smartly and efficiently. China grew, agriculture in China grew because of the use of agro inputs, but they mismanaged those inputs. They applied far too high rates with a lot of impacts on the environment. So what we are trying to do is use the inputs, the fertilizer, the improved seeds, the other agronomic practices, use them as efficiently as we can. So the little investment that the farmer makes, that he makes money with it. And the fourth area we are working on is value addition and agro-business. We know that producing crops is not the best way to make money. Most of the money goes into value addition. Cassava production is good. Turning cassava into high quality cassava flour is much better. Producing soybean is good. Turning it into feed for chicken, milk, oil is much better. And so our fourth program is looking for research solutions to actually address some of those value-added processing. So what we are doing these days is, and the example that we'll probably talk about later into Africa is a good example of that. We go into farming communities, see what their problems are, and then prioritize our research solutions or the search for solutions based on those priorities. So our research is, before we used to call about research for development, isn't it? So today we talk about research in development. We know if we are not addressing priority issues for farming communities, we are going to waste our time. So all our research currently is operating to that. So you're worried that we are a bit far away often and there's a disconnect between what we are doing and what people want. I think that disconnect is gradually disappearing, or I could say actually in a lot of initiatives gone. Wow. If I may add one more thing, and that's equally important, IITA is a research organization. We place our research into development, but we are scientists. I'm a scientist. So we know that if we don't create the right partnerships with the development agencies, including IITA, including the large NGOs, including private sector, we know if we don't have those linkages, we are not going to deliver on our research products. So a second thing that has changed drastically is that we are now partnering with a large number of extension services, development agencies, people who are working in the supply and market value chains for all of those products.